Hello everyone, welcome to Viti Pathshala. So in this class we would be going to study about the Magd Empire, and this would be our fourth chapter of the 11th class of the Tamil Nadu SCRT book. And till now we have done, in the last class we have completed the Buddhism and the Jainism, the emergence of the new religions we have done, and they come as an outcome of the, or they have challenged the Brahminical supremacy as it was higher in the previous religions. Now let's start with this chapter, and this chapter is about the emergence of the new state and the empire. So after studying this chapter, you would acquire the knowledge about the emergence of the first two important empires of the India, the significance of the invasions of the Persian and the Greeks, the socio-political changes from the 6th to the 3rd century BCE, the pre-Mauryan administration, and the socio-economic condition, and the dharmic state of the Ashoka through his edicts. Now we have seen that there were the several Mahajanpadas. Now the Mahajanpadas, they will turn into, and an empire would be formed in India. From the 6th century to the 3rd century BC, North India passes through the major political and social changes. Buddhism and Jainism emerged as the prominent religion, having a large number of the followers. Referred to as the Shramanic religion, from the word Shramana in the Sanskrit, mean a teacher. The two religious systems were antithetical to the mainstream Vedic religion. As a consequence of the new beliefs and the ideas propounded by Jainism and Buddhism, the social order, largely centered on the Vedic rituals, underwent a significant change. As people of many religious faiths were part of the emerging society, on the political front, minor states and the federations of the clans were merged through the conquest to create an empire during this period, resulting into a large state ruled by the Chakravartin or Ekrat, that is the emperor or the one supreme king. The rise of a centralized empire in the Gangetic plains of the present day Bihar and the eastern Uttar Pradesh changed the social, economic, and administrative fabric of the country. The flat plains and the availability of the plentiful water from the perennial rivers such as the Ganga and its tributaries were along the favorable ecological condition which promoted the rise of the large state in a particular region. Rivers also acted as the major waterways for the trade and the travel. Bimbisar, who was a contemporary of the Buddha, started the process of the empire building in the Magd. It was strengthened by his son, the Ajashatru, and then by the Nandas. The empire reached its glory and peaked with the advent of the Mauryan Empire, founded by the Chandragupta Maurya. And the first three Mauryan emperors, the Chandragupta, Bindusar, and the Ashok, were the best known. After the Ashokas, the decline of the Mauryan Empire went into the decline. Now, first we will start with the sources. The names of the Chandragupta and his two successors in the Mauryan Empire, as well known now. But reconstructing their lives and the careers was a laborious and difficult process for the earlier historians. There are hardly any comprehensive contemporary accounts of the literary works which refers to the Mauryan emperors, though they are mentioned in the various Buddhist and the Jain texts, as well as in the some of the Hindu works like the Brahmanas. The Mahavamsha, the comprehensive historical chronicle in the Pali from the Sri Lanka, is an important source. The scattered information from these sources have been corroborated by the account of the Greek historians who left their account about the India following the Alexander's campaign in the northwestern part of the country. Archaeology and the epigraphy are the tools that provide the rich information for the historians to understand earlier periods of the history. Archaeology is particularly important because excavations reveal the nature of the urban morphology, that is, the laying of the cities and the construction. So, archaeology is important, excavation and the nature of the urban morphology. Now, they also provide the concrete information about the material culture of the people in the past, such as the metals that were known, materials and the tools they used, and the technology they employed. Now, from the remains of that civilization, the remains tell us about the metals they were using, the materials and the tools they had, and the technology they were using. For example, 100 years or 200 years from today, if the archaeological department searched or wanted to write the history, then the tools or the metals of this time would be very significant, and they would be telling about the this period. The archaeological finds in the Gangetic regions give us the solid proof about the nature of the urban centers established in the region in the course of time. Epigraphical evidence is scanty for the period. The most widely known are the edicts of the Ashok, which have been discovered in the many parts of the country. In fact, the reconstruction of the modern period to a great extent became possible only after the Brahmini script of the inscriptions at the Sanchi was deciphered by the James Princip in the 1837. Now here this becomes the important. Now here this is the Brahmini script becomes the important, and the James Princip, that is the 1837. Information about other edicts in our parts of the country also became available at that time. Now it must be remembered that these were the oldest historical artifacts found in India in the 19th century, until the archaeological excavation unearthed the Indus Valley towns of the Harappa Mohenjo-daro in the 20th century. All the edicts begin with the reference to the great king, thus they spoke about the Devanam Piyadasi, that means they belong to the gods and of pleasing looks. And the geography spread of the edicts must clear that this was a king who had ruled over a vast empire, but who was the king. Now Puranic and the Buddhist texts refer to the Chakravartin named as the Ashok. As more edicts were deciphered, the decisive identification that the Devanam Piyadasi was Ashok was made in the 1915. One more edict, when deciphered, which referred to him as the Devanam Piya Ashok, made the reconstruction of the Mauryan history possible. Let us now turn to the two later sources. The first is the rock inscriptions of the Junagadh near the Girnar in the Gujarat. Now this was carved during the regime of the Rudradaman, the local ruler, who dates back to the 130 to 150 CE. Now it refers to the Pushyagupta, the provincial governor, the Rashtriya of the empire, Chandragupta. Now this is of the two importance, and the first thing here is that it indicates the extent of the Mauryan Empire, which had expanded as far as to the Gujarat. So one is about the extent. Now it shows that the more than the 4 centuries after his death, the name Chandragupta was still well known and remembered in many parts of the country. So second is the remembering of the name after the death also. A second source of the literary work, the play that is the Mudra Rakshash by the Vishak Dutt, was written during the Gupta period. Sometime after the 4th century CE, it narrates the Chandragupta accession to the throne of the Magd Empire and exploits of his chief advisor Chanakya and the Kautilya. By listening the strategies he used to counter an invasion against the Chandragupta. Now this play is often cited as a corroborative source since it supports the information gathered from other contemporary sources about the Chandragupta. It is important to note from both these sources that the fame of the Chandragupta had survived long after he was gone and became imbibed in the popular lore and memory. They thus attest to the significance of the oral tradition which are now accepted as an additional valid source of the history. Now that was about the sources from which we come to know about the Magd Empire. Now, a rise of the Magd under the Haryank dynasty. Now you all know that the first dynasty to be established there was the Haryank dynasty. So in this sequence we would be going to study number of the dynasties, and the first one comes as the Haryank dynasty. Among the 16 Mahajanpadas, Kasi was initially powerful. However, the Koshala became dominant later. A power struggle broke out between the Magd, Koshala, Vriji and the Avanti. Eventually, Magd emerged as the dominant Mahajanpadas and established the first Indian empire. So first Indian empire was established by the Magd. The first known ruler of the Magd was Bimbisar of the Haryank dynasty. He extended the territory of the Magdam Empire by the matrimonial alliances and the conquest. So here you have to remember his policy was the matrimonial alliances and the conquest. By marrying of his sisters to the Prashanjit under the ruler of the Koshal, he received the Kashi as the dowry. Now he also married to the princes of the Lichavis and the Madr. Now he maintained the friendly relations with the Avanti but annexed the Ang by the military might. So the strong should be conquered by the matrimonial alliance, and the weak should be conquered. Weak should be attacked, and military conquest should be there on the weak. Thus the Magd became the powerful and the prominent power. During his regime, the Bimbisar patronized the various religious sects and their leaders. He had an encounter with the Buddha as well. His son Ajashatru ascended the throne by killing his father, King Prashanjit. That was his mama. His maternal uncle, the King Prashanjit, immediately took back the Kashi, which he had handed out to the Bimbisar in the dowry. Now this led to a military confrontation between the Magd and the Koshal. The struggle lasted until the Prashanjit was overthrown and died at the Rajgriha, the capital of the Magd Empire. Koshal was annexed. Koshala was then annexed to the Magd. Ajashatru also fought and won the battle against the Lichavis. He defeated the Lichavis and the Mallas. Ajashatru is believed to have met Buddha in his lifetime. By the time the Ajashatru died in 461 the BCE, the Magd had become the undisputedly the strongest power. The Haryank dynasty was succeeded by the Shishu-Nag dynasty. Now you have to remember about the two rulers only in this empire, and these two rulers are one is the Bimbisar and other is the Ajashatru, and you should know about that the Shishu-Nag dynasty would be the next, which would be followed by the Haryank dynasty. Shishunag, a viceroy of the Banaras, deposed the last Haryank king and ascended to the throne. The Shishunags ruled for the 50 years before the throne was usurped by the Mahapadmanand. So after the Shishunag, the next will be the Mahapadmanand. So next we would be going to study about the Nandas, the first empire builder of the India. About 100 years after the Ajashatru's demise, the Nandas became the emperors of the Magd Empire. In the 362 BCE, the first Nanda ruler was the Mahapadmanand. It is believed that he usurped the throne by murdering the last of the Shishunag kings. Under the Nandas, the empire expanded considerably, and wealth and the power of the Nandas became widely known and feared. Mahapadmanand was succeeded by his 8 sons, and they were together known as the Navanandas or the 9 Nandas. During the process of the empire building, Nandas exterminated many Kshatriya clans and subjugated the Kshatriya ruled kingdoms, which had still retained a degree of the autonomous authority, thus creating a centralized state. An inscription known as the Hathi Gumpa, that is the elephant cave, from the Udaygiri near the Bhubaneswar, Odisha, records the aqueduct built by the King Nand 300 years earlier. This is also indicative of the geographical extent of the Nand Empire. Though the Nandas were able administrators and had strengthened the empire, Magd Empire, they were not popular among the people. So remember that these people, they were not popular among the people. A centralized state required a new administrative framework to govern extensive territory, the creation of a bureaucracy, resources of the money, and the men for managing the administration and the army. A system of the revenue administration has to be developed to raise the funds needed for the state through the taxation. Such a political formation led to the development of the cities as the administrative centers distinct from the villages and the rural areas. A large standing army was required for expanding and the retaining the empire. Now, Persian and the Macedonian invasion. The period from the 6th century witnessed the close cultural contact of the northwest of the India with the Persia and the Greece. It might be surprising to know that the Gandhar and its adjoining regions on the Indus were part of the Achaemenid Empire of the Persia. Cyrus, the emperor of the Persia, invaded the India around the 530 BCE, and he destroyed the city of the Kapish. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Gandhar constituted the 20th and the richest satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire. The region continued to be the part of the Persian Empire till the invasion of the Alexander the Great. The inscription of the Dara I, that is the Darius I, mention the presence of the Persians in the Indus region and include the people of the Gandhar Harvati mark these as the subjects of the Achaemenid Empire. The word Hindu appears for the first time in inscriptions of the Dara I Persepolis, Iran. Darius lists Hindu as the part of his empire. The word Sindhu, denouncing a river in the general, and Indus in particular, became Hindu. Now the problem is with that the Greek dropped the S and called it Hindu, and which eventually came to be known as the Hindu and later the in India. Now the word Hindu, it is not connected to the religion Hindu, but it is related to the river Indus, because these people were not able to pronounce the S. So that Hindu became the Sindhu became the Hindu. Next is the Takshila. Takshila or the Takshila is situated in the present day Pakistan. Between the 1st century and the 4th century BC, it was the part of the Achaemenid Empire of the Persia because of its strategic location on the trade route between the east and the west. It emerged as an important center of the learning and the culture. Students came from the far and the wide to the Takshila in search of the knowledge. The city was brought to the light by the excavation carried out in 1940 by the Sir John Marshall. Takshila is considered one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the any ancient civilization. Panini seems to have compiled his known work Ashtadhyayi here only. Next is the impact of the Persian contact. As the northwestern part of the India came under the control of the Persian Empire from about the middle of the 6th century, the region became a center of the confluence of the Persian and the Indian culture. So it became a confluence of the culture of the Persia and the India. The Persian contact left its impact on the art, architecture, economy, and the administration of the ancient India. The cultural impact was felt most on the Gandhar region. The most significant impact was the development of the Kharosthi script. It was used in the northwestern part of the India. It was used by the Ashok in his inscriptions in the Gandhar region. The Kharosthi script was derived from the Aramaic, which was used widely in the Achaemenid Empire of the Persia. Like the Aramaic, Kharosthi was written from right to the left. Persian Singloi silver coin is an imitation from the region. The earliest coins in the India are traced to the period of the Mahajanpadas. The Indian word for the coin, Karsha, is a Persian origin. The coins might have been inspired by the Persian coins. The existence of the coins in that period suggests trade links between the India and Persia. The Ashokan edicts might have been inspired by the edicts of the Achaemenid king, that is the Darius. दारा ने भी अपने बनाए थे और उसी से जो है इंस्पायर होके अशोक ने भी अपने बनाए होंगे एडिक्ट्स. Ashokan edicts used the term lipi instead of the Iranian term dipi. The Mauryan art and the architecture shows the traces of the Persian influence. Mauryan columns of the Ashokan pillar are similar to the column found in the Achaemenid Empire. The bell-shaped capital of the column, especially the lion capital of the Sarnath pillar and the bell capital of the Rampurwal pillar, show the resemblance to the design found in the Achaemenid column. Similarly, the pillared remain of the palace in the Patliputra display a remarkable similarity to the pillared hall in the Achaemenid Empire. However, the craftsmen, though inspired by the Persian art and the architecture, gave a definite Indian character to their work. Connection between the Persian and the Sanskrit. There are linguistic similarities between the Rig Veda and the Avesta. The term Aryas was also used by the ancient Persians. According to the Indologist Thomas Burrow, only the phonetic change has occurred over the time. The bogus Koi in the northeast Syria inscription dating back to the 1380 BC records a treaty between the Hittite and the Mitanni king. It mentions the name of the few Rigvedic gods such as the Indra, Urvan, Varun, and the Mitra and the Nastya, that is the Ashwins. So this was about the Persian and the Persians coming to the India and the Persians' relations with the India. Now one of the major was the Alexander's invasion that we have to study. During the Dhananand, So did his Dhananand regime. The Alexander invaded the northwest India in the many ways. The invasion by the Alexander is a watershed in the Indian history. It marked the beginning of the interaction between the India and the West, which spent many centuries to follow. Greek historians began to write about the India, and the Greek governors and the kings ruled in the northwestern region of the India, which introduced new styles of the art and the governance. After his conquest in the Punjab region, Alexander expressed his desire to march further east to attack the Magd Empire. However, his already tired troops had heard about the great emperor in the east, Nand, and his formidable army, and refused to engage in a war against such a powerful adversary. In 326 BCE, when the Alexander entered the Indian subcontinent, after defeating the Persians, Ambi, the ruler of the Takshila, surrendered and accepted the suzerainty of the Alexander. Now remember this person, Ambi. The most famous of the Alexander's encounters was with the Porus, the ruler of the regime, with the Jhelum and the Bias. Now two armies met at the battle of the Hydropus, in the which the Porus was imprisoned. So this battle is very important for the exam point of view. Later, impressed by the Porus' dignity, the Alexander restored his throne on the condition of accepting his suzerainty. His battle-weary soldiers refused to march further. Alexander did not want to proceed against the reluctance of his army. During his reign, Alexander died of typhoid in the Babylon. The impact of the Alexander's invasion led to the establishment of the Greek Stephites in the northwestern region of the Indian subcontinent. Trade routes opened up with the west. There were the four different types of the routes in the use, which facilitated the movement of the Greek merchants and the craftsmen to the India, establishing the direct contact between the India and the Greece. As the trade contacts increased, the many Greek settlements were established in the northwest of the India. So it was more important for the trade routes. Alexandria near the Kabul, the Bokefela near the Peshawar in the Pakistan, and the Alexandria in the Sindh were some of the prominent Greek settlement. The Greek accounts of the India provide the valuable information, but with a bit of the exaggerations. Alexander's death created a void in the northwestern, facilitating the accession of the Chandragupta Maurya to the throne of the Magd. It also helped him to conquer the numerous small chiefdoms in the northwest and bringing the region under his empire. So this was a brief thing that we have studied in this chapter. Now the major thing starts from here, and that is your Mauryan Empire. So this part is very important from the exam point of view, Mauryan Empire. Contemporary accounts by the Greek historians show that the Chandragupta was a youth living in the Takshila when the Alexander invaded the India. Greek historians have recorded his name as the Sandrocoptus or the Sandrocotus, which is eventually modified forms of the Chandragupta. Inspired by the Alexander, the Chandragupta led a revolt against the Nandas years later and overthrew them. Chandragupta achieved it either by the inciting the people to rise against an unpopular monarch or by the soliciting their support in the overthrowing an unpopular king. Chandragupta established the Mauryan Empire and became the emperor in 321 BCE. We know from the Junagadh rock inscriptions referred the earlier that the Chandragupta had expanded his empire westward as far as the Gujarat. One of his greatest achievements, according to the local accounts, was that he waged the war against the Greek prefects left behind by the Alexander and destroyed them, so that the way was clear to carry out his ambitious plan of the expanding the territories. Another major event of his regime was the war against the Seleucus, who was one of the Alexander's general. So when Alexander went back, he left the Seleucus Nicator in the India, or the part which he has captured. After the death of the Alexander, Seleucus had established his kingdom extending up to the Punjab. Chandragupta defeated him in a battle sometime before the 301 BC and they drove him out of the Punjab region. The final agreement between the two was probably not too acrimonious, since the Chandragupta gave the Seleucus the 500 war elephants and the Seleucus sent an ambassador to the Chandragupta's court. Now, this ambassador is very important in the history and the exam point of view. And this ambassador is the Megasthenes, and we owe much of the information that we have about the Chandragupta in the book written by the Megasthenes, and that book is the Indica, and Indica, the account of the written by the Megasthenes. The original of the work is lost, but the many Greek historians had reproduced the parts of his account describing the court of the Chandragupta and his administration. Now, about the Chandragupta. Chandragupta was obviously a great ruler who had to reinvent a strong administrative apparatus to govern his extensive kingdom. The system of the governance and the polity is discussed in the next section. Chandragupta was ably advised and aided by the Chanakya. Now, this person is very important in our history and the economy also. Known for the political maneuvering in the governing his empire, the contemporary Jain and the Buddhist texts hardly have any mention of the Chanakya, but popular oral tradition ascribes the greatness of the Chandragupta and his regime to the wisdom of the genius Chanakya. Chanakya, also known as the Kautilya and the Vishnugupta, he was a Brahmin and was a sworn adversary of the Nandas. He is credited with having devised the strategy for overthrowing the Nandas and helping the Chandragupta to become the emperor of the Magad. So, if there was no Chanakya, then there was no Chandragupta. Now, Chandragupta exists on the behalf of the Chanakya. Now, Chandragupta too became the emperor of the Magd. He is celebrated as the author of the Arth Shastra, and this book is a treatise on the political strategy and the governance. So, we study this person in political science also, and this book also. Remember, this is a star marked Arth Shastra. His intrigues and the brilliant strategies to subvert and the intended invasion of the Magd is the theme play of the Mudra Rakshas. Next in the line comes the Bindusar. After the Chandragupta, his son Bindusar succeeded his empire as the emperor in the 297 BCE. Is a peaceful and the natural transition. We do not know what happened to the Chandragupta. He probably renounced the world. According to the Jain tradition, Chandragupta spent his last years as ascetic in the Chandragiri near the Sarvanbera Gola in the Karnataka. Now, this also becomes the important, and some people say that he had fast until death. He had gone to death. Bindusar was clearly a capable ruler and continued his father's tradition of the close interaction with the Greek states of the West Asia. He continued to be advised by the Chanakya and the other capable ministers. His sons were appointed as the viceroy of the different provinces of the empire. We do not know much about these military exploits, but the empire passed intact to his son Ashok. Bindusar ruled for the 25 years and he must have died in 272 BCE. Ashok was not his chosen successors, and the fact that he came to be thrown only 4 years later in the 268 BCE would indicate that there was a struggle between the sons of the Bindusar and the succession. Ashok had been the viceroy of the Takshila when he puts down a revolt against the local officials by the people of the Takshila, and was later the viceroy of the Ujjain and the capital of the Avanti, a major city of the commercial trade. As emperor, he is credited with the building the monumental structures that have been excavated in the site of the Patliputra. He continued the tradition of the close interaction with the Greek states in the West Asia, and there was mutual exchange of the emissaries on the both sides. Now we see that the Ashok killed his 99 brothers and only left his own the one brother, and then he came to the throne. The defining event of the Ashok rule was the campaign against the Kaling. So this is a one major part in the Ashok's life period, that is the Kaling, the present day Odisha, in the 8th year of this regime. Now this is the only recorded military expeditions of the Mauryas. The number of those killed in the battle, those who died subsequently, and those reported ran into the tens of the thousands. The campaign had probably been more ferocious and brutal than the usual, because this was a punitive war against the Kaling, now which had broken away from the Magd Empire. The Hanthi inscription speaks of the Kaling as a part of the Nand Empire. हाथी गुम्फा ये बताता है कि जो कलिंग था वो पहले नंद एम्पायर का था, और बाद में अशोक के टाइम पे या चंद्रगुप्त मौर्य के टाइम पे वो अलग होना चाहता था, अपना अलग एम्पायर बनाना चाहता था, कलिंग एम्पायर. सो कलिंग जो है वो जो है अशोक को पसंद नहीं आया. अशोक ने क्या किया, हमला कर दिया. Ashok was devastated by the carnage and moved by the suffering that he converted to the humanistic values. He became a Buddhist, and his newfound values and the beliefs were recorded in a series of the edicts, which confirm his passion for the peace and the moral rightness of the Dhamma, that is the Dharm or the in the Sanskrit, Dhamma or the Dharm in the Sanskrit. Edicts of the Ashoka. If we talk about the edicts of the Ashoka, the edicts of the Ashoka thus constitute the most concrete sources of the information about the Mauryan Empire. There are 33 edicts. They comprise the 14 major and rock edicts, 2 known as the Kaling edicts, 7 pillar edicts, some minor rock edicts, and the few minor pillar edicts. The major rock edicts extended from the Kandahar in the Afghanistan, Shahbaz Gadi, and the Mansehra in the northwest Pakistan to the Uttarakhand district in the north, and the Gujarat and the Maharashtra and the West Odisha in the east, and the far south as the Karnataka and the Kurnool district in the Andhra Pradesh. Minor pillar inscriptions have been found as far north as the Nepal near the Lumbini. The edicts were written mostly in the Brahmini script and the Magadhi and the Prakrit. So they were mostly recorded in the Magadhi and the Prakrit. The Kandahar inscriptions are in the Greek and the Aramaic, while the 2 inscriptions in the northwest Pakistan are the Kharoshti script. So this information you must know about the Ashok. The geographical spread of the edicts essentially defines the extent of the vast empire of which the Ashok ruled. The second inscriptions mention the lands beyond the borders. The Chodas or the Cholas, the Pandyas, the Kshatriya Putta, the Kerala Putta, the Cheras, even the Temra Parani and the Yon king Antiochus, and the kings who are the neighbors of the Antioch. The edicts stress the Ashokans' belief in the peace, righteousness, and the justice. So these edicts, their focus is on the peace, righteousness, the justice, and his concerns for the welfare of his people. By rejecting the violence and the war, advocating the peace and the pursuit of the Dhamma, Ashok neglected the prevailing philosophy of the statecraft, and that stressed that an emperor had to strive to extend and consolidate his empire through the warfare and the military conquest. Third Buddhist Council, which was held during the time of the regime of the Ashok. One of the major events of the Ashok regime was the convening of the Third Buddhist Sangha, that is the council in the 250 BC in the capital Patliputra. Ashok's deepening commitment to the Buddhism meant that the royal patronage was extended to the Buddhist establishment. An important outcome of the Sangha was that the Decision of the expand the reach of the Buddhism in the other parts of the region, and they sent the missions to convert the people to the religion. Buddhism thus became a proselytizing religion, and the missionaries were sent to the regions outlying the empire, such as the Kashmir and the South India. According to the popular belief, Ashoka sent his two children, Mahindra and the Sanghamitra, to the Sri Lanka to propagate the Buddhism. It is believed that they took a branch of the original Bodhi tree to the Sri Lanka. Ashoka to have ruled until the 231 BCE. Sadly, though his revolutionary views of the governance and the non-violence find a resonance in the contemporary sensibilities, they were not in the consonance with the realities of the times. After his death, the Mauryan Empire slowly disintegrated and died out within the 50 years. But the 2 centuries prior to the Ashok's death and the disintegration, the Mauryan Empire were truly the momentous in the India history. This was a period of the great change. The consolidation of the state extended over nearly 2/3 of the subcontinent had taken place, with the formalized administration, development of the bureaucratic institution, and the economic expansion, in addition to the rise of the new orthodox religion and the philosophies that questioned the establishment of the orthodoxy. Now we will learn more about the Mauryan state, that is the Mauryan polity and the state. So what was the polity and the state at that time? The major areas of the concern for the Mauryan state were the collection of the taxes as the revenues to the state, and the administration of the justice, security, and the defense against the external aggression. This required a large and the complex administrative machinery and the institutions. Greek historians, taking their lead from the Megasthenes, describes the Mauryan state as a centralized state. So Mauryan state was a centralized state. What we should infer from this description as a centralized state, that the uniform pattern of the administration was established throughout the very large area of the empire, but given the existing state of the technology in the communication and the transport, a decentralized administrative system has to be in place. The bureaucratic setup covered the hierarchy of the settlements from the village to the towns, provincial capitals, and the major cities. The bureaucracy enabled and they required an efficient system of the revenue collection. Since it needed to be paid out of the taxes collected equally, the very large armies of the Mauryan Empire could be maintained only with the revenue raised through the taxation. The large bureaucracy also commanded the huge salaries. According to the Arthashastra, the salary of the chief minister, the Purohit, and the army commander was the 48,000 pannas, and the soldier received only the 500 pannas. If we multiply this by the number of the infantry and the cavalry, we get an idea of the enormous resources needed to maintain the army and the administrative staff. So much of the money was to be used. So this part, that is about the Arthashastra, it is very important. Sometimes the question comes and the examiner asks you about the Arthashastra itself. Perhaps the most detailed account of the administration is to be found in the Arthashastra, though the work itself is now dated to a few centuries later. However, it must be remembered that the Arthashastra was a prescriptive text which laid down the guidelines for the good administration. If we add to this the information from the Ashok's edict and the work of the Megasthenes, we get a more comprehensive picture of the Mauryan state as it was. Now, provincial administration. At the head of the administration was the king. So head was the king. He was assisted by a council of the ministers, a Purohit or a priest, which was a person of the great importance, and the secretary is known as the Mahamantriyas or the Mahamantris. The capital region of the Patliputra was directly administered. The rest of the empire was divided into the 4 provinces based on the Swarnagiri near the Kurnool in the Andhra Pradesh. Ujjain, Avanti, that is the Malwa, Taxila in the north, and the Toshali in the Odisha in the southeast. The provinces were administered by the governors who were usually the royal princes. In the regime, the revenue and the judicial administration and the bureaucracy of the modern state was replicated to achieve a uniform system of the governance. Revenue collection was responsibility of the collector general, that is called as the Samatra. So these name you should remember for your exam point of view. So the head was the king, Purohit was the priest, and there were the secretaries that were called as the Mahamantris, and the collector general or the revenue in charge was the Samhatra. Now, who was also the in charge of the exchequer, that as he was in effect like a minister of the finance. He had to supervise all the provinces, fortified the towns, mines, forests, trade routes, and the other which were the sources of the revenue. The treasurer was responsible for keeping a record of the tax revenues. The accounts of the each department had to be presented jointly by the ministers to the king. Each department had a large staff of the superintendent and the subordinates officers linked to the central and the local government. So you can see that the brown one is the empire, the Mauryan Empire, and in the time of the Mauryan, this black one in between, the star marked, they are the capitals which was divided, or they were the 4 areas, 4 divisions. So Patliputra, Ujjain, and the Takshila, and Suvarnagiri in the Andhra Pradesh. Now, district and the village level administration, the next level of the administration came at the district, villages, and the towns. The district was under the command of the Sthanika, which officials known as the Gopas were in charge of the 5 to the 10 villages. Urban administration was handled by the Nagrik. Villages were the semi-autonomous and they were under the authority of the Gramini, appointed by the central government and the council of the village elders. Agriculture was then, as it remained down the centuries, the most important contributor to the economy, and the tax on the agricultural produce constituted the most important source of the revenue. Usually, the king was entitled to the 1/6 of the produce. So जो भी आप बो रहे हो, अगर 6 पार्ट पर आप बो रहे हो तो 1 पार्ट आपको राजा को देना है. In reality it was often much higher, usually about 1/4 of the produce. ये तो कागजों में था, असल में कितना लिया जाता था? 1/4 लिया जाता था. Now, sources of the revenue. The Arthashastra recommended the comprehensive state control over the agricultural production and the marketing, with the warehouses to store the agricultural products, and the regulated markets were also there in order to maximize the revenues from the most important sector of the economy. Other taxes included the taxes on the land, on irrigation if the sources of the irrigation had been provided by the state, taxes on the urban houses, customs, and the tolls on the goods transported for the trade, and the profits from the coinage and the trade operations carried on by the government. Lands owned by the king, forest, mines, and the manufacture of the salt, on which the state had a monopoly, were also important. Their sources of the revenue. Now, judicial administration. Justice was administered through the courts, which were established in all the major towns. The 2 types of the courts are mentioned. Now, the Dharmkshatriya courts. These mostly dealt with the civil law relating to the marriage, inheritance, and the other aspects of the life. So one is the Dharmkshatriya courts. The courts were presided over by the 3 judges well versed in the sacred laws, and the 3 amatyas, that is the secretaries. Another type of the court was called as the Kant Kasho Dhanna. Kant Kasho Dhanna is the removal of the thrones. This was also presided by the three judges and the three amatyas. The main purpose of these courts was to clear the society of the anti-social elements and the various types of the crimes, and it functioned more like the modern police and relied on the network of the spies for the information about the such anti-social activities. Punishments for the crimes were usually quite severe. The overall objective of the judicial system as it evolved was the extended government and the control over the most aspects of the ordinary life. Next topic is about the Ashoka's dharmic state. Ashoka's rule gives us an alternative model of the righteous king and the just state. He instructed his officials, the Yuktas, that is the subordinate officials, Rajuks, the rural administrators, and the Pardeshikas, the head of the district, to go on the tours every 5 years to instruct the people in the Dhamma major rock edict third. Ashoka's injunctions to the officers and the city magistrates stressed that all the people were his children, and he wished for his people what he wished for his own children. That they should obtain the welfare and the happiness in the world and the next. These officials should recognize their own responsibility and strive to be impartial and see to it that the men were not imprisoned or the tortured without the good reason. He added that he would send an officer every 5 years to verify if his instructions were carried out. That is written in the Kaling Rock Edict 1. Ashok realized that an effective ruler needed to be fully informed about what was happening in the kingdom, and they insisted that he should be advised and informed promptly wherever he might be. So that is written in the Rock Edict, that is the 6th. He insisted that all the religions should coexist and the majestic of all the religions were honored. The Major Rock Edict 7 and the 12, providing the medical care should be one of the function of the state. The emperor ordered the hospitals to be set up to treat the human being and animals. Major Rock Edict 2, preventing unnecessary slaughter of the animals and the showing the respect for all the living beings, was another recurrent theme in his edicts. In Ashoka's edicts, we find an alternative, humane, and the empathetic model of the governance. Now, this line becomes an important for your mains perspective. You can mention this. The edicts stress that the everybody, officials as well as the subjects, act righteously following the Dhamma. Now, in the above picture, they have shown you the edicts. So, the white one is there are the minor edicts. In the black one and the your square is the major rock edicts. Then triangle are the pillar edicts, and the territorial limits is shown by a line, a dash line. Next is the economy and the society. First in the that comes the agriculture. Now, agriculture was the major source of the revenue also. Agriculture formed the backbone of the economy. It was the largest sector in the terms of its share in the total revenue to the state and the employment. The Greeks noted with the wonder that the two crops could be raised annually in India because of the fertility of the soil. Besides the food grain, India also grew the cash crops such as the sugarcane and the cotton, described by the Megasthenes as a reed that produced the honey and the trees on which the wool grew. The fact that the agrarian sector would produce a substantial surplus was a major factor in the diversification of the economy beyond the subsistence to the commercial production. Now we have done 1 hour, we have studied. Now I would be taking a 2 to 3 minutes break, and then we will be moving ahead. So let's start again, and we will start with the craft and the goods. Many crafts producing a variety of the manufacturers flourished in the economy. We can categorize the products as the utilitarian or the functional, and the luxurious or the ornamental. Spinning and the weaving, specially of the cotton fabrics, relying on the universal availability of the cotton throughout India, were the most widespread occupations outside of the agriculture. A great variety of the cloth was produced in the country, ranging from the coarse fabric used by the ordinary people for the everyday use to the very fine texture worn by the upper classes and the royalty. The Arthashastra refers to the specialized textiles, regions of the producing the specialized textile, that is the Kasi, that is the Banaras, Wang, Bengal, Kamarupa, Assam, and the Madurai, and the many others. Each region produced many distinctive and the specialized varieties of the fabrics. Cloth embroidered with the gold and the silver was worn by the king and the members of the royal court. Silk was known and was generally referred to as the Chinese silk, which also indicates that the extensive trade was carried on in the Mauryan Empire. Metal and the metal works were of the great importance, and the local metal workers worked with the iron, copper, and the other metals to produce the tools, implements, vessel, and the other utility items. The iron smelting had been known for the many years, but there was a great improvement in the technology after the about 500 BCE. which made it possible to smelt iron in the furnaces at the very high temperature. Archaeologists find show a great qualitative and the quantitative improvement in the iron production. After this date, improvement in the iron technology had widespread implications for the rest of the economy. Better tools like the axes made more extensive clearing of the forest possible for the agriculture. Better plows could improve the agriculture processes. Better nails and the tools improved the woodwork and the carpentry as well as other crafts. Woodwork was another important craft for the shipbuilding also, making the carts and the chariots, the house constructions, and the so on. The stonework, stone carving, and the polishing had evolved as a highly skilled craft. This expertise is seen in the some sculptures in the stupa at the Sanchi and the highly polished chunar stone used for the Ashoka's pillars. A whole range of the luxury goods was produced, including the gold and the silver articles, jewelry, perfumes, and carved ivory. Now, there is the evidence that the many other products like the drugs and the medicines, the pottery, dyes, and the gums were the produced in the Mauryan Empire. The economy had thus developed far beyond the subsistence production to a very sophisticated level of the commercial craft production. Crafts were predominantly urban based hereditary occupations, and the sons usually followed their fathers in the practice of the various crafts. Craftsmen worked primarily as the individuals, though the royal workshops for the producing the cloth and the other products also existed. Each craft had a head called as the Pramukh, that the Pramukha or the leader, and a Jeshta or the elder, and was organized in a senior, Srenier or the guild. Now these words you have to remember for exam point of view. Despite between the ceremonies were the resolved by Mahasethi, and this ensured the smooth functioning of the craft production in the cities. Next comes is about the trade. Now in these things you don't have to go in the more detail because ancient history is not so much important. Don't stick to these only 5 question or the 2 to 3 sometimes question comes, and one question would be from the Jain and the Buddhism. So you can focus on the other important things that are more important, that is your modern history and the in particular the Indian independence movement. Now here comes the trade. Trade or the exchange becomes a natural concomitant of the economic diversification and the growth. Production of a surplus beyond the subsistence is the futile unless the surplus has exchange value, since the surplus has no use value when the subsistence needs have been met. Thus, as the economy diversified and the expanded, exchange becomes an important part of the realizing the benefit of the such expansion. Trade takes place in the hierarchy of the markets, ranging from the exchange of the goods in a village market, between the villages and the towns, within a district, across the cities, in the long distances, over land trees, and across the borders to other countries. Trade also need a conducive political climate, and was provided by the Mauryan Empire, which ensured the peace and the stability over a very large area. The rivers in the Gangetic plains were the major means of the transporting the goods through the northern India, and the goods were transported further west overland by the roads. Roads connected the north of the country to the cities and the markets in the southeast and in the southwest, passing through the towns like the Vidisha and the Ujjain. The northwest route linked the empire to the central and the western Asia. Overseas trade by the ships was also known as the Buddhist Jatak tales, referred to the long voyages undertaken by the merchants. Seaborne trade was carried on with the Burma and the Malay archipelago and with the Sri Lanka. The ships, however, were probably quite small and might have hugged the coastline. Now we do not have the much information about the merchant communities. In general, the long distance overland trade was undertaken by the merchant groups traveling together as a caravan for the security, led by a caravan leader known as the Mahasarthava. Roads through the forest and the unfavorable environment like the deserts were always dangerous. The Arthashastra, however, stresses the importance of the trade and ensuring its smooth functioning. Trade had to be facilitated through the construction of the roads and the maintaining them in the good condition, since tolls and the octroi were collected on the goods when they were transported. Toll boats must have been set up and the manned on the all the trade routes. Urban markets and the craftsmen were generally closely monitored and the controlled to prevent the fraud. The Arthashastra had the long list of the goods, agricultural and the manufactured, which were traded in the internal and the foreign trade. These include the textile, woolens and the silks and the aromatic woods, animal skins and the gems from the various parts of the India, China and the Sri Lanka. Greek sources confirm that trade links with the West through the Greek states to the Egypt. Indigo, ivory, tortoise shell and the pearls, perfumes and the rare woods were exported to the Egypt. Next comes is the coins and the currency. Now, though the coins was known, barter was the medium of the exchange in the pre-modern economies. The Mauryan Empire, the silver coins was known as the panna, was the most commonly used currency. Hordes of the punched marked coins have been found in the many parts of the North India, though some of these coins may have been from the earlier period. Thus, while coins were in use, it is difficult to estimate the extent or to which the economy was monetized. Next comes is the process of the urbanization. Urbanization is a process of the establishment of the towns and the cities in an agrarian landscape. Towns can come up for the various reasons: as the headquarters of the administration, as the pilgrimage center, the commercial market centers because of their locational advantage on the major trade routes. Now, in what way do the urban settlements differ from the villages or the rural settlement? To begin with, the towns and the cities do not produce their own food and depend on the efficient transfer of the agricultural surplus for their basic consumption need. A large number of the people resided in the towns and the cities, and the density of the population is much higher in the cities. Cities attract a variety of the non-agricultural workers and the craftsmen who seek employment, thereby forming the workforce for the production of the manufactured goods and the services of the various kinds. These goods, in addition to the agricultural products brought in from the rural countryside, are traded in the market. Cities also tend to house a variety of the persons in the service related activities. The Sangam poetry in the Tamil and the Tamil epics provide the vivid pictures of the cities like the Madurai, Kanchipuram and the Pampur as the teeming with the people, which is vibrant market and the merchants selling a variety of the goods, as well as the vendors selling the various goods including food door to the door. And though these literary works relate to a slightly later period, it is not different in the terms of the prevailing levels of the technology, and these descriptions may be taken as an accurate depiction of the urban living. The only contemporary pictorial representation of the cities is in the sculptures on the Sachi, which portray the royal possessions, and the cities are seen to have the roads, multitude of the people and the multi-storied building crowded together. Urbanization of the 6th century BCE. Now, these are not important for the exam point of view. It will never come in the exam. These things the UPSC will not ask about the urbanization, and these are not the concerns, because there is a limit of the asking the question. Only 100 question can be asked. So the UPSC will stick to the more important parts rather than these topics. One of the first prerequisites for the urbanization is the development of an agriculture base. This had evolved in the Indo-Gangetic plain, and from the very early on, there are the references to the cities like the Hastinapur and the Ayodhya. By about the 6th century BC, urbanization had spread to the Doab, and many new city centers, Kosambi, Bita, Vaishali, and Rajgir, among others, are mentioned in the region. Buddhist texts about the Buddha preaching were always located in the urban centers. Cities developed primarily because of the spread of the agriculture and the wet rice cultivation, in particular in the Doab region. After the marshy land was drained and they reclaimed, the cultivation, the fertile soil, and the plentiful availability of the water from the perennial rivers made it possible to raise even the two crops of the rice and the production of the large agricultural surplus to feed the cities. The improvements in the iron technology also had an impact on the economic life both in the rural and the urban areas. As the Magd grew, many regional centers like the Ujjain were also incorporated into the empire. Now, housing and the town planning, towns were often located along the rivers, presumably for the ease of the access to the transportation. Now, they were surrounded by the moats and a rampart to provide the defensive protections. They were always open to attacks since the treasuries holding the government revenues were housed in them. In addition to the fact that a trading center, the local people and the merchants were also wealthy. As the towns became more prosperous, the quality of the houses, which were built of the mud brick and even of the fried brick, improved. Towns also had other facilities like the drains, ring wells, and the mud pits, testifying to the development of the civic amenities and the sanitation. The excavations from the Mauryan period show that the standard of the living had improved as compared to the earlier period. The houses were built of the brick, and the cities had the ring wells and the soak pits. There was a quantitative increase in the use of the iron and the variety of the iron artifacts. And the next point is the city of the Patliputra. Patliputra was the great capital city of the Mauryan Empire. It was described as the large and the wealthy city situated at the confluence of the Ganga and the Son rivers, stretching in the form of the parallelogram. Now, it was more than the 14 kilometers in the length and the 2.5 kilometer wide. It was protected by an outer wall made up of the wood with the loopholes for the shooting arrows and the enemies. Now there were the gates for 64 gates to the city and the 570 watchtowers. Now there was a wide and the deep moat outside the wall, which was fed by the water from the river, which served both as the defense and an outlet for the sewage. Now there were many grand palaces in the city, which had a large population. The city was administered by the corporation of the 30 members. Ashoka added to the magnificence of the city with the monumental architecture, and he added the capital like the many pillared hall. Next comes is the art and the culture. Though we have studied in between of the chapters, so they have also given to the last part also. Most of the literature and the art of the period have not survived. The Sanskrit language and the literature was enriched by the period work of the grammarian, the Panini, and the Katyan, who was contemporary of the Nandas and had written the contemporary on the Panini's work. Now, Buddhist and the Jain texts were primarily written in the Pali language. Evidently, many literary works in the Sanskrit were produced during the period and find the mention in the later works, but they are not available to us. The Arthashastra notes the performing arts of this period, including the music, instrumental music, bards, dance, and theater. The extensive production of the crafted luxury products like the jewelry, ivory carving, and the woodwork, and especially the stone carving, should be included in the products of the Mauryan art. Many religious castes and the communities lived together in the harmony in the Mauryan society. There is the little mention of any overt dissension or the disputes among them, as in the many regions of that era, including in the ancient Tamil Nadu. Courtesians were accorded a special place in the social hierarchy, and their contribution was highly valued. The last part of the chapter is the decline of the Mauryan Empire. The highly centralized administration became the unmanageable when the Ashok successors were weak and inefficient. A weak central administration with large distance to communicate led to the rise to the independent kingdoms. After Ashok's death, the kingdom split into two. There were invasions from the northwest. The notable groups that undertook the military expeditions and established the kingdoms on the Indian soils were the Indo-Greeks, the Shakas and the Kushans. The last ruler, that is the Bridhrath, was the king killed in the by this commander-in-chief, that is the Pushmitra Sung, who founded the Shung dynasty that ruled India over the 100 years. Now this was all. You should remember this timeline also. Now questions: Brahmini script, James Princip. Then the first known ruler of the Magd was Dash of the Haryang dynasty, Bimbisar. Dash was the ruler during the invasion of the Mahapadmanand was the ruler. Sorry, the Dhananand. No, Mahapadmanand ruler. Now, a comprehensive historical chronicle in the Pali from the Sri Lanka, serving as the important source of the Mauryan period, is the Mahavamsha. A play, that is the Mudra Rakshas, Megasthenes Indica, the good administration Arthashastra. You must be having the old version of the book, Raja. Sorry. So that was all. We will meet now on the Monday with a new chapter. So do take care, revise your things, and बार बार रिवीजन करो, पढ़ो इन चीज़ों को, बार बार कंसोलिडेट करो. And if you have any doubt, you can contact me and you can ask any and every doubt. And the simpler version of this I have done earlier in my classes for the prelims classes. So thank you. Bye. Take